And so then with that bodhicitta, motivation, we can do the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. And anyway, apologies for the confusion with the center's Zoom account today. We'll get that addressed separately. But so we're on actually, how does he say it? Mind. Something I was just going to comment, a general comment, is usually like there are different translations. Usually they say, well, here it's mind and mental factors, right? Which is how it's usually translated. Sometimes they'll call it mind. I think it was Geshe Rabdin's book, maybe. Yeah, Geshe Rabdin's book calls it mind. Geshe Rabdin had a book called Mind and Its Functions. I mean, I think the mental factors is a more is closer to the Tibetan. Semjong, I think would be translated mental factors. But it's an interesting way to think about it, mind and its functions. Like, I just want to emphasize that I was thinking about it as we were getting ready to do discrimination, the next of the mental factors. That remember, because like the mind and the mental factors are not separate entities, right? We said this earlier on in the series of classes, but as we get into these, I think it's useful to remember that it's more like these are like functions of the mind, right? That you can identify and recognize, but they're not separate from the main mind, right? So I just want to remind us of that as we're going through these, it's not like there's the main mind and then there's feeling and then there's discrimination as if they're separate entities or separate things, right? These are mental factors or functions of the mind. They're things that you can notice your mind doing, right? But they're not separate. They're not some separate thing from the main mind that's aware of an object or whatever it's aware of, So I want to emphasize that. Anyway. And so in terms of, so right now we're on the, they call them the 5 omnipresent mental factors, right? And we covered, and I mentioned that the first, all the mental factors are important, but the first 2 are among the 5 aggregates. So they're particularly emphasized by the Buddha. And the third one is even the author of our text says it may be the most important, intention. So those 3 we're spending more time on because they're particularly important, and then we're going to cover all of them, but these are particularly important ones, right? And so we covered feeling, right? And now we're up to discrimination, which is the second of the 5 omnipresent. Omnipresent means always there, right? They're always there with the mind. And this one here is translated as discrimination. And again, it's it's a mental factor, and it's also one of the 5 aggregates, right? That the Buddha taught when he teaches the 5 aggregates. Right? So it's the same, right? It's not like a separate, just like feeling was one of the 5 aggregates, that mental factor, this one, discrimination, is one of the 5, is identified as one of the 5 aggregates. And I was just sort of noticing, like, I think discrimination is a good translation, it's often used, but other translators have translated this one as recognition or discernment. I think those are both fine, reasonable translations. They get at the feeling of what this is, or the sense of what this is. Okay, so the text says, regarding the entity of discrimination, the compendium of knowledge, right, so the Abhidharma, says, and then it asks a question: what is the defining characteristic of discrimination? And then the response: it has the characteristic of knowing upon aggregation. It has the entity of apprehending the sign and apprehending the mark. through which one designates an expression to objects of perceptions, hearing, differentiation, and knowledge. So we'll go through this step by step a little bit. And he actually below he explains. So first of all, you could say, what is this knowing upon aggregation? Right? What is that referring to? But the author explains. Yeshi Gelson explains that. Let's see, right? Yeshi Gelson explains that. So he says, just as it has been said above, it is a knower that upon the aggregation of the three, the object, the sense power, and the primary consciousness. Right. So upon aggregation, actually, it's an important point, right? Like knowing doesn't actually, it's interesting. Knowing doesn't exist independently, does it? Right. In other words, so even we could say we're looking at it from a geometrical point of view, you could say that knowing is a dependent arising, right? And so, and we've covered this in other areas, right? So in other words, for something to be known, three things have to come together: an object of knowledge, right? A sense power and a consciousness, right? And we've said this before, but without those three, if any one of those is missing, then it can't be, then that event of knowing won't happen, right? So if somebody's, if you have to have an object to be known, but then also you have to have a working sense power, right? So if the object to be known is auditory, but if a person's ear organ is not working, then they're not going to hear it, right? In the same way, if there's not a consciousness, you could have a perfectly designed ear, but a corpse's ear won't hear, right? In other words, there's not a consciousness there. So you have to have all three. And if you're in a complete silence, there's no object, right? So then sound wouldn't be heard, even if you have a consciousness and a perfectly functioning ear organ in the silence of a vacuum, there wouldn't be sound heard, for example. So upon the aggregation of those three things, then there's a perception, right? And then here it says, so it apprehends the uncommon sign of an object. And or above it says apprehending the sign and apprehending the mark through which one designates. So we're going to go through step by step what that means, what that all is. But to start with, though, I would say this: we're going to get into details of these phrases, sign and mark. But you can say uncommon sign. One way of describing that is it's the unique characteristic of that object. And again, it's sort of like let's say this the right way. Like, we'll get into what that means. Actually, I don't want to. Maybe I won't go too deeply into it now because it's complicated a little bit. So, but we'll say uncommon. For now, we can say the uncommon sign or the unique characteristic or characteristics of that object. We'll go on more because now below it says, what is discrimination? It apprehends the sign of an object. When discrimination is divided, there are two: apprehending a sign and apprehending a mark. These terms, I think, are a little, I don't know, they end up being used in a little bit of a complex way, and that's okay. But here we'll just follow the text, and then hopefully it'll become clear. So in brief, that at this part of the text, he's differentiating that. He says the apprehension of a sign is the apprehension of an uncommon sign of an object which appears to a non-conceptual consciousness, and the apprehension of a mark is the apprehension of an uncommon sign of an object that appears to a conceptual thought. So what this is getting at is a few things, or a few implications of this. One is, remember I just said this is one of the omnipresent mental factors. So if discrimination is always there, that means it has to be there in non-conceptual knowers and also in conceptual knowers. And so this is pointing out that there are two different, so it's using two different terms to kind of tease that out. So the way it's used here, the sign, right, or the uncommon sign of an object is that which is known by a non-conceptual consciousness, right? So an eye consciousness, an ear consciousness, a nose consciousness, or a tongue consciousness, and so on, right? And then the mark in this one would be conceptual, so it'd be known by the conceptual knower, conceptual mind, right? So going back, so let's start with the mark, right? The conceptual knower. That would be language, right? So that would be like if you said, if you look and you say red, right? That would be the mark, right? If you're using a visual consciousness is apprehended an object, and then the mind is going to be engaged in discrimination, it could discriminate redness versus blueness, versus yellow, and so on, right? Or like if it's an ear consciousness, right? The non-conceptual knower would use a term, right? Like, oh, that's loud sound. Oh, that's a very quiet sound. So it's language. So the mark in this sense would be the uncommon sign, which would be like the name of that object. Now, going backwards though, the sign, right? The non-conceptual, this is getting at something that's not verbal, right? It's not a verbal discrimination. And what it's getting at, actually, I'll read a phrase I wrote down. Discriminates the uncommon features of an object in the sensory field. That was the term, I think, from Geshe Rabten. I like his text, by the way. And so what that's getting at is that the sensory consciousnesses do discriminate, but not linguistically. And I'll say it this way, like, so I was just sort of contemplating this, right? And like, there are many examples, but I'll use one to start with. Like, there's good, actually, they did like interesting scientific research with, I'm gonna use ear consciousness as the example, right? That newborn babies can, what's the word? If they hear their mother's voice, as compared to some other person's voice, it changes their physiology, right? There are measurable differences in the physiology of a baby when it hears the mother's voice versus somebody else's voice. That's the function. That's as a result of that the baby can discriminate, right? Its mother's voice from other voices, and it's not a and the baby at that point doesn't yet know terms, right? It's not saying mom. So there's going to be quite a while until the baby can say mom, right? Or mama or whatever, or ama, or different ones, right? Different ways to say. They all sound similar, don't they? All in various languages. Certain word for mom. I always think that's interesting, isn't it? Sounds similar, but anyway. So that's an example, like, of a non-conceptual knower, right? A non-conceptual knower with discrimination. But actually, there are many. All of our sensory consciousnesses discriminate in some way, and actually, if they didn't, like you wouldn't, like, I'm trying to say this the right way, like within a sensory field, like when you we do it, what's the word? It's a natural function of our consciousness, right? Like when you look, your eye sees a tree, right? Like you don't just see a mass of color, right? Your eye like kind of discriminates to look at an object, and actually, if you look around your room right now, right, you'll notice your eye kind of focuses on objects, right, even before you label them. And it's interesting, isn't it? Like, yeah, I'm just doing it myself, right? Like, your eye is drawn to a certain object in the room. It does, and it differentiates it from the other. So if you look on your wall at a picture or something, or an object, against the wall, your eye consciousness will focus in on that object, and already is discriminating it from the wall itself, right? Then your mind may engage and say, oh, that's a picture of, or that's a painting of, or that's a whatever it may be. John.
Yeah. You've used different examples. Most of them are about visual.
Yeah.
But on the early part of this piece, you talked about the senses. Are we talking about all 5 senses or just visual?
Yeah, all 5 senses do this. So all 5 senses discriminate, and it'll say that in the text in a few soon. But yeah, that was why I used the example of the baby with sound, for example. But the same would apply to smell, and so and the same thing, like, yeah. So it's smell. Take that example, right? Like before you even let's say it right. It's true, isn't it? Before you can label, sometimes you immediately know the label for a smell, right? But there are times where, like, you'll discriminate a certain smell. Like you go, oh, something, you could like, you smell, what's the word? You smell something, and then you start to go, like, even before you think, you're like, you see somebody's turning, right? And actually, if you see, animals do that, don't they? Like you can see, I mean, some animals have amazing sense of smell, right? And they'll start doing whatever, following a smell or turning towards the source of a smell. So all the senses discriminate in the sense of like, say like, yeah. So I like this way of putting it. Discriminate the uncommon feature of an object in the sensory field, and the object could be touch, smell, sound, and so on. But and actually, I'm just giving another example. Actually, like if you ever like take the example, if you're passing by a deer in the woods, right? And if you make a sound, and then you watch like the deer's ear, like can turn towards you, right? That would be that's a physical manifestation of the mental factor of discrimination, right? The deer discriminated the sound, and hasn't yet labeled it, right? At a certain point, if the deer sees you and then it runs, then I guess maybe the deer has sort of done its own version of a mark. It's thought, I don't know, that's obviously in its own way, it's saying danger, right? But even before that, there's a discrimination that happens on a sensory level to all the senses, through all the sense consciousnesses. Anyway, so first of all, so it happens with all the different ones, and again, it's getting at this point though that there are two different ways we use the wrong way. Two different ways the mental factor of discrimination functions. One is non-conceptually, which means non-verbally, and the other is conceptually, which means with words. So that's the important distinction. And Sujata.
I'm amused by this experience that I have around certain smells and tastes that I have decided that I do or do not like things. But if I don't know what it is, sometimes I like the thing. So like my mind is discriminating, and I'm like, oh, what is that? That's kind of interesting. I kind of like that. And then the minute somebody tells me it's black licorice, then I'm like, oh, that's disgusting. But I didn't think before I could figure out what it was, I was knowing that it was a thing that I know, but I don't really hate it until I've got the word attached to it, right? And the same happens with smells. Like I've decided I hate bergamot until I tried somebody's like body scrub that had bergamot in it. It was the best body scrub I've ever used. And now I buy the body scrub of the thing that I hated, It's just, so there's something about like, I'm curious if there's about the reification through language of the discrimination, like there's the non-conceptual discrimination. I mean, so when you're talking about the baby, the intensity of the experience though is still happening physiologically for the baby without the word mom, whatever. But I'm just curious about, whether or not there's just more sort of reification of the next steps when it gets more conceptual, or not, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really what I guess I'll say too. I mean, in terms of the point we're at now, I think your example is really interesting in the sense of you can see how then, like, sometimes the right, like, there's the sensory consciousness doing its discrimination, right? And what you're getting at in a way is how discrimination and with the previous mental factor of feeling can be related. They're different, right? But they're, and how so one point is like, so we're feeling and discriminating at the same time, right? Like is one point. Another point you're getting at though, actually, and this is not, and I mean this isn't taught right here, but I'll just make a general comment is, say it the right way, like, our, say this the right way, like our mind, I guess I'm going to say from what you said, it shows what you're getting at shows how powerful our minds are, right? And that the mental, if we habituate ourselves to thinking something is, and this is sort of more conceptual now and connected to other mental factors, but if we habituate our mind to a positive association to a certain discrimination, then it can overwhelm our sensory experience. And that's where then we can come to like anything, actually, right? I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? If you look at like, I just think that's really strange in a way, like, but it's true, isn't it? Is that human beings can come to like anything. You know, if you label it enough, you know, you habituate your mind enough, you know, it's like, anyway, it's strange that way. And that's part of our problem, is that, you know, actually, if you think about like the perfection of joyous effort, Lama Tsongkhapa talks about the perfection of joyous effort is that bodhisattvas habituate their minds to love and enjoy virtue. And so they take joy then and pleasure in virtue, you know, which leads to enlightenment. Whereas most of us, we're unskillful, right? We label, you know, Shanti Davis says it very clearly there, we label pleasurable or good on what's actually suffering or cause of suffering, and therefore we continue in samsara. So it's very strange, isn't it? Like, and we think like, sometimes I'm just going off on a tangent here from your point, but yeah, you know, I remember one time, like, I think some of you heard this story, but one time I was talking with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and we were talking about this point, and I was saying, well, some things people just don't like, you know, like it's not, and Rinpoche was saying, no, it's just your mind. And then I said, well, like, people don't like, you know, if you come up to somebody and like start beating them, they're not going to like, you know, if you walk up to a person and just start beating them, people aren't going to like it. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who was a monk, said, no, in America, some men pay for that. And I said, what, Rinpoche? And he said, yes, I heard some men pay for like these women to beat them up, and then they think that's great. And he said, so people, you know, he said, you're wrong. You know, I said, oh, and then Rinpoche, I said, you're right, Rinpoche, and I'm wrong. Yes, I accept your point. And his point was like anything, you know, he was saying anything. People are crazy. You know, he was like, people are insane. Anything people can think, oh, this is good. And I was like, wow, he's right. So that's not, I mean, you know, that's where the mind, the mental, and that would be, you know, I mean, that's more than just conceptual discrimination. Conceptual discrimination is just recognizing a punch as a punch or something, but this would be then other mental factors, right? Attachment and grasping and so on, that then get associated with that discrimination. You know, and feeling also, right? It's a mental feeling that overwhelms the physical feeling, and that happens often. But going back to consciousness, let's say, of a certain sense, right, discriminates, and then the mind discriminates, and they can sometimes be in conflict, right? The nose, if in terms of the feeling, but then the mind, usually the mental consciousness will overwhelm, won't it? That's what usually happens. The mental consciousness overwhelms the sensory consciousness in terms of how we interpret our experiences. And then Lynn has a commentary.
I was thinking of like protest music, like South Africa has had, you know, under apartheid, you know, now has wonderful protest music. So did Latin America. And people heard the music. They had consciousness of the music and responded to it independent of knowing who was singing, what the song was, or being able to repeat it. So that would be a sense consciousness, right?
The hearing, like, so the ear conscious would hear music, right?
Yeah, and they wouldn't have to translate in their mind saying, oh, that's such and such a song. It would be immediate.
Yeah.
So how do I say this? And the irony is the dictators always go after the artists because they're doing this stuff on a level they can't stop. And so but the interesting thing is, how do we get to the point where we hear the music and translate it into something we're in favor of? That's where, because it seems like something conceptual has to happen to get there. But I maybe not. Maybe the first instance it's not conceptual, and then it becomes conceptual.
That's the way I would think of it. It's first non-conceptual, and then I think you're right. Yeah. So it would, and ordinarily that's usually how it works, isn't it? I mean, sometimes something's totally mental, like, you think of something and then you have a feeling about it or whatever, and so on. You discriminate just in your mind, but in everyday life, often, I would say it this way, oftentimes what's happening is there's a non-conceptual knower, and then that's followed by a conceptual knower. And like, just giving the example of music, like a person might hear music, and they could discriminate. They would have a non-conceptual factor of discrimination that's recognizing, for example, it's recognizing that it's music and then differentiating that from, say, a car horn in the distance or a bird passing, sound of a bird outside, or some other, whatever, all other sounds, or somebody's voice in the distance and so on. So they could non-conceptually, their ear consciousness could discriminate music. But you're right, then the mind will say, once the mind says, oh, music, that's already mental discrimination, right? Once the mind is recognizing music. Then if the mind says, I like that music, that's of course mental. That's now, that's also conceptual. And then if somebody says, oh, that's, such and such artist, and that's all conceptual, of course, knowers. But what's interesting then is like, it's like similar to what Sujata was getting at, but then it becomes like, then the next time you hear that music, still it's going to start with non-conceptual, right? Because it's your ear consciousness that hears it. But now, very quickly, your mental consciousness is going to have more concepts about that sound than it did the first time. So the first time you hear a sound, you have fewer concepts about it. You might still recognize, like, the ear consciousness either way is going to do a certain level of discrimination, but you're going to have more, what's the word? More concepts the more you know about a certain thing. And I want to point out also, that's not, I just want to say this too, and the conceptual is not in and of itself good or bad. If that makes sense. Like, so when you said, like, then you made an interesting point, I think, which is like, I mean, actually, the concepts, actually, I just want to point this out, like, because this is a little beyond what this point is making in the text, but discrimination can be, it's there with all mental factors, so it's there with both virtuous and non-virtuous mental factors. So let's say I'm just going to use your example to make a point. Let's say somebody's playing protest music, right? Now, if you're also a protester, right, then you're going to have a positive, you're going to have all kinds of positive concepts potentially about that music. Think, oh, this person's awesome and they're inspiring and I love their music, and the same, so the basic ear conscious discriminating music is going to be that, right? Just the basic. Then you're going to have all these concepts associated with that music. But let's say you're a dictator, right? That same music, you're going to have very different concepts about it, right? You're going to think, I want to kill that person who's making that music or something, or I want to put them in jail or whatever, so the concepts can be different about the same, two different people have very different concepts about the same auditory phenomenon. But anyway, that's a little beyond the scope of just discrimination. That's other mental factors coming in, anger, aversions, some other, other ones. So,
but the question still is, how do you get from, you have to have some construct to get to the conceptual from the sense consciousness.
and here,
how you get from one to the other is,
actually,
you have to have some structure in your head about that.
Well, and here I think, actually, this is a good point, just to go back to now what we're actually, connecting what you're asking back to the actual text. Here, what we're getting at in a way is very simple. So, and I want to say that too, that in this sense, discrimination is a simple phenomenon. In other words, so, because, and some of those other concepts are more elaborate, I'll call them elaborations of the conceptual, but discrimination really is more about the name of something. And it's more like, if you think of, I'm doing this, like, when little kids learn, like it's through repetition, it's like when you look at a little kid's thing, right? Like, like you have a picture of a dog and it'll say dog, right? and then somebody will say dog. You know, because the sound dog has nothing to do with an actual dog, right? It has other names in other languages. But what happens is this level of discrimination, when we're getting to the mark, like so conceptual knowers, it's really just that. In other words, it's that say it the right way. So where it says the apprehension of a mark is the apprehension of an uncommon sign and object which appears to a conceptual thought, and mark is language or name. So there it's like that the child learns that when they see, you know, like, and then there comes a point, right, where the kid goes, dog, and then everybody's like, oh, I know it's a dog, you know, and you're happy, right? And everybody's happy. Like, that's the level. So it's very simplistic. You know, this level of discrimination is getting at something fairly simple in the mind that serves as the basis for all the other, if that makes sense. So there is, once you can discriminate dog, then you can say, I love dogs, or I'm terrified of dogs, or I hate dogs, or I want to protect dogs. There are all kinds of other concepts, but they're all grounded on this initial discrimination. And in the same way, you know, like when you meet a person, right? And then you know, like first you can discriminate, oh, that's human. But then there comes a point where you know the person's name, right? And then once you know the person's name, actually, you can start to elaborate all kinds, you know, again, this is my friend, this is my enemy, and so on. But discrimination is that basic level of sort of the you know, like, oh, that's Lynn, you know, and once you know that's Lynn, you can think, then you can have all kinds of things. Oh, Lynn is this wonderful person, and somebody else can say, I can't stand Lynn, she's terrible, and whatever. You know, those are further elaborations, but the first is the basic, like, linguistic labeling that says, what's the uncommon feature? What, you know, like, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's also contextual. Like, let's say if you know, like in a courtroom, somebody might look at you and say opposing counsel or something, or whatever, and that would be your uncommon feature there. Does that make sense? So then, like, Lynn would be, you know, I mean, that would be a different discrimination, actually. You know, but it would be like, what's this? Who is this person in this context? You know, and then in another context, the person might look and say, you know, whatever else they might, you know, some other conceptual. So the conceptual language or name isn't always the same in all contexts, right? Like, but it's like it's that initial discrimination of like, what's the uncommon feature of this phenomenon, of this person, this thing. And then what you're getting at, then I think, is once one's done that, then one can have all other kinds of concepts, right? Like, but they're all based on that initial discrimination. So not all those other ones aren't in and of themselves necessarily discrimination. The discrimination is the knowing the uncommon feature. And then Frank has a commentary question.
Yeah, to what extent does this have a relation to the idea of, you know, object imputed on a basis of designation? Is there a relation to that where, right, so we're the object imputed, we hear the sound, object imputed upon the basis of designation. Is that the same as discrimination, or?
That's an interesting question. Imputed, like, first of all, I'll make a couple comments. First is like, I think you're asking a good question. Second is, you know, the presentation here by Yeshe Gelson is not uniquely Madhyamaka, right? He says that at the beginning, he says he's going to present things in a way that's true of all, like, so of all the different Buddhist schools. So like Vaibhashikas would agree with this. So from one perspective, I would pause and say, well, we have to be a little careful, because Vaibhashikas would also use this, and Sautantrikas would use this term of discrimination in their teachings on mind and mental factors. But they wouldn't say things are merely labeled, you know, so that's one point to make. It's like, you know, because this is a common Buddhist presentation. But then if I think what you're asking is uniquely a Madhyamaka question on this point. And if you think of this from a Madhyamaka perspective, actually, it's interesting, isn't it? Because even the non-conceptual, right? Like, I'm going to say from a Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective, just for a moment in relation to your question, and this is just me sharing my own thoughts. I haven't read a specific Madhyamaka commentary on this, but I think it's fairly clear if you look at Chandrakirti's position as a Prasangika Madhyamaka, even the sensory, like when the non-conceptual knower discriminates an object, it's discriminating it based on an appearance of that object existing intrinsically. So even on the level of non-conceptual knower, there's already discrimination depends upon the imprints of previous, for an ordinary person, a non-Arya, the non-conceptual mental factor of discrimination depends upon the imprints of ignorance, and therefore things appearing as if they exist separately, independently, in their own right, intrinsically from their own side. And your eye consciousness, according to, now this is a unique presentation of the Prasangikas, but they would say even the ear consciousness, the eye consciousness, the nose and so on, have an element of error. All conventional consciousnesses that know conventional objects have an element of error. So they would say the non-conceptual knower perceives things as if they have inherent existence, which is incorrect, and they discriminate based on that, actually, according to, I think it would be my interpretation of Chandrakirti. And then when they label with language, that would also be based on that same kind of ignorance. So yes, it would be like that would be say it the right way. I guess I'll just make one more subtle distinction to contemplate. Is my own and again, this is just my own contemplation, but Arya bodhisattvas, let's say, also have to their eye consciousness an appearance of inherent existence, and they still discriminate then based on that, right? Like from a visual, auditory, and so on. Or is their sense conscious would still discriminate in that way when they're not in meditative equipoise on emptiness, but they don't grasp at that. They don't believe in that appearance of intrinsic existence. But an ordinary person does grasp it, does believe in the false appearance of intrinsic existence. Yeah, and then we use language in a way that is what's the word? So our use of language is connected to our grasping as those things as existing in that way, in a way in which they don't exist. So that's true for ordinary people. Yeah, so discrimination, so from a Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective, discrimination would be intimately connected to and one other point I'll make is it's interesting that they say, this is just my own reflection again, that Buddhas don't have conceptual thought. All Buddha's knowing is non-conceptual. Even the Buddha's knowing of conventional realities is non-conceptual. And actually, because actually you can get at it now, just John, for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, if you contemplate it, right? Because we said it. What is the definition of conceptual in Buddhism, right? In Buddhism, the definition of conceptual is, what's the word? Viewing a sound generality, meaning language, and a meaning generality as suitable to be mixed, right? So that's getting at language here. Right, so that's how it's a conceptual knower. You have a sound generality, right, and you're connecting it to some kind of meaning. So this is that. It could be a very simple meaning like blue. But Buddhas don't. So if Buddhas are known in a non-conceptual way, they don't view sound generalities and meaning generalities suitably mixed. So they don't use language in the same way, right? Because Buddhas do use language, they teach language, but they don't relate to language in the same way as non-Buddhists. So anyway, I think that's all connected to what you're asking.
Thank you.
Lynn, yep. Oh, you're muted.
I have a question, and maybe this is a stupid question, but what is primary consciousness separate from sense consciousness? Is it eye consciousness?
What you said? What is primary consciousness separate from the sense consciousness?
Yeah, because it says here, you have to have all three: primary consciousness, sense power, and object.
Oh, I see. No, so in that sense, the sense power is not a consciousness. The sense power is like you could say it's the subtle part of the organ. Like, so like, I mean, in Buddhist terms, in ancient Buddhist texts, they use a different thing, but the way you could say it's like to use this isn't precise according to the Buddhist terminology, but it's different between like, so you have to have like, let's say a sound, you have to have not just an ear, a gross ear organ, but an eardrum and the neurons in your ear, but then you also have to have a mind, right? So the primary consciousness is the presence of mind there. So it's not enough to have, as I was saying, it's not enough to have the ear. So their sense power is like the eye power, the eye, the subtle parts of the eye organ, the subtle parts of the ear organ, and so on. And then the consciousness there, primary consciousness, means that there has to be mind. That it's not enough that, and that was why I said, like, so, because you could have a perfectly, if a person recently died of a heart attack, but had good hearing, their ear organ is fine, right? But there's no mind there anymore. They're dead, so they won't hear. So the primary conscious means mind. Mind has to be present. Yeah, that's what that. So, okay, so you get the idea. So there, and really, I mean, anyway, there you could, I mean, you guys are asking good questions, which implies, there are a lot of implications from this, but I hope it's clear now that the main point is that, there are non-conceptual knowers which discriminate in the sensory field, and that's the sign one here, and then there are conceptual knowers which discriminate by knowing the name. Right. And I want to say also that, and remember this, that discrimination is simple in a sense. I mean, it's simple in the sense that it's not getting at all the complex concept. It doesn't include every single concept that we have there. We're going to get to other mental factors that do all kinds of other concept, have all other kinds of concepts. But here it's, the definition is, right, that which apprehends the uncommon sign of an object, right? So that if that's the definition, it's like it's knowing, it's the uncommon feature or the uncommon sign or the uncommon thing about that object. And then it says the basis, just go quickly through this part. It says the basis of engagement of these two types of discrimination are perceptions, hearing, differentiation, and knowledge. Their meanings are as follows. Perceptions involve designating an expression to objects manifestly perceived, right? Hearing involves designating expressions and depends upon hearing credible words. And so this is just getting at, there are different ways that we discriminate something. Then differentiation involves designating an expression to objects as ascertained in dependence upon signs. So and then the last one is knowledge involving designating an expression to objects ascertained directly. And so what this is getting at is there are different, and this is getting at different ways of knowing, which we've covered in other classes in more detail. But like, so the example hearing means that you're discriminating based on hearing from somebody you trust. So if somebody says, let's see, right? So if you're on a trip and somebody says, oh, if you follow that trail, it's dangerous, and then you look at that trail and your discrimination, your conceptual discrimination is danger, right? And so then let's say you don't go down that trail. That's discrimination, right? You're now saying dangerous trail, but it's based on having heard. You didn't actually see that it was dangerous. Perceptions would be designating based on manifestly perceiving it, right? So in other words, if you started to walk on that trail and you saw a very sheer cliff and no place to put your foot, that would be different than having heard it, and so on. And then differentiation, and it's where it says independence upon signs means logical reasoning. so that would be if you didn't hear it from somebody else and you didn't see it directly, but you reasoned it out, right? So that would be for yeah, that would be that one. So like, based on correct reasoning. And the knowledge involves designating an expression to objects ascertained directly. So that would be very simple, isn't it? Like you see blue and you ascertain directly blue and then you label blue. Then it goes back to the Abhidharma, and it says the treasury of knowledge explains discrimination as being twofold: the apprehension of a sign with regard to an object and the apprehension of sign with regard to a convention. And then it says the apprehension of a sign with regard to an object means to apprehend it through individually distinguishing the object's particularities, such as blue, yellow, and so forth. The apprehension of a sign regarding a convention, or here language. Convention means expression of language or term. So it means to apprehend it through individually distinguishing the convention's particularities when one thinks this is a man or that is a woman. So this really, and this is why I said earlier, it's a little confusing if you don't have the context, because here it's using sign. Earlier, sign was non-conceptual, right? And mark was conceptual. I thought that this is a little bit confusing use of terms, that here sign is being used, the second usage, number 2 right now, they're using the term sign, but it's for a conceptual knower, right? A term. So I found that a little confusing, but that's the way it's being used. So that was why I warned you earlier, sign and mark in that one paragraph or whatever are being used a certain way, but now the word sign is being used in a different way. But it's getting at the same point, which is there are conceptual knowers that apprehend directly, right? And there are non-conceptual knowers which apprehend objects directly, and then there are conceptual knowers which know in a context of terms and language. And then then that's the main difference there. So the conceptual, again, it's just another way it's another text. He's drawing from another text to differentiate between conceptual and non-conceptual discrimination. Then Sujata, you have your hand up. Oh, you're muted.
I wanted to go back to the step before where we were talking about the perceptions versus knowledge in those 4. I'm having trouble distinguishing between the 2. So the first and the last, and that leads to 4.
Let me go back and double check that.
That manifestly perceived versus ascertained directly is my struggle.
It's interesting, yeah, because try to look at the I'm going to read you another translation of the same, and then we'll see if we can. So let's see. Okay, perception. So perceptions involve designating expressions to objects manifestly perceived or seen, whereas for knowledge involves designating expressions to objects ascertained directly. This thing about the 4 divisions of it. Yeah, that's interesting. It's not really a clear. Let me just pull up another text here. Actually, we'll look here. See if there's a different translation of the same. Yeah, I'm just pulling out another translation of the same. There we go. Yeah, okay. Oh, that's interesting. He doesn't, okay. So I'll read you another translation of the same text that maybe we'll see if it makes it clear. One point, and Venerable George in his commentary says this, is actually perception, the Tibetan word, and this translator translated it the way Venerable George suggested, which is, he says actually perception was how this translator translated, but it literally means seeing, so to see. And so this translator translated that way. So the first one, perception, this translator says to see is to make a proposition about what has been seen in immediate perception, Whereas he says, he translates knowledge as full cognition. So he says full cognition is to make a proposition by way of a concept about this object as it is in the certainty of immediate perception. So they're quite similar, isn't it? I'm gonna go back. So they both say to make a proposition. One says to see is to make a proposition about what has been seen in immediate perception. The other says full cognition is to make a proposition by way of concept about the object as it is in the certainty of immediate perception. So it seems like they're actually quite similar. I think if you look at, I'm going to compare that now back to what this text says. Ascertain directly, manifestly perceived. So they're both, actually, it's interesting. They both contain, if you look at the two translations, they're both saying, they're both making a proposition, which means conceptual, right? It means they're making they're adding a concept. They both say it's immediate perception, right? So based on direct perception. The only difference really in this, if you look at this, the second translation is, one is to make a proposition about what has been seen in immediate perception. The other is to say, by way of concept, first of all, which is clear, but this object as it is in the certainty. So it looks like what they're getting at is that there's more confidence in your certainty of knowing in full perception. So I think it looks to me like knowledge involves designating expression of objects ascertained directly, manifestly perceived. Yeah, I think this translation is a little more helpful in the sense of that it looks like the difference. I'm going to compare it to one more translation here. Perceptions involving manifestly perceived. Yeah, I think this is the only one that really gets at a difference, which is this one is getting at that the difference seems to be a certainty or an increased confidence. So, which I guess gets at why they translate as full knowledge or full cognition or knowledge. So it looks like it's like there's a greater confidence or a greater certainty in your knowing. Is the only difference I can see personally.
Thanks, that's helpful. And it sort of tracks to the common meaning of those words, perceptions versus knowledge, too.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? So I think that's what maybe the translator there was getting at. I'm trying to see if there's any other, I don't know. There's one other text, but it doesn't seem like this one has a translation of that particular differentiation. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. So those are the only translations I have of that. So that looks like that's the difference. Like that's the only difference I can find between those two.
Thanks.
Sure. And again, just to point out here, right? Again, you can see that it's getting at what we said earlier, right? The uncommon sign of an object, right? So like the examples here, blue, yellow, right? It's the one is getting at that, and the other, like the other example, they're conceptual here. This is a man, this is a woman, right? Again, it's like it's conceptual, right? So like a term, yeah, that fits with, yeah. So it's knowing by way of terms. Yeah. Then the next paragraph, yeah, is, we don't need to, is really just getting at something the same as this came up, almost the same thing in I think it might have been almost the same words in the section on feeling, right, where it's talking about, that you can differentiate. It's just getting a list, so you can differentiate discrimination based on 6, and here 6 would be the aggregate. Remember, it said at the beginning it was an aggregation, right? So that discrimination happens, that depends upon an aggregation. And so it's the different versions of the aggregation. So it could be a visible form, the eye sense power, and the eye consciousness. And then, Lynn, this is related to that question you asked about it has to include a consciousness, right? It's a different term there, eye consciousness versus there it's a primary consciousness. But primary because it could be any of these. though, right? So it could be if it's an eye, if it's a visible form and an eye sense power, then it has to be an eye consciousness. If it's a sound, an ear sense power, and an ear consciousness, and that applies to all the 5 sense consciousnesses. And then the last would be the mental, right? So it would be discrimination arising from contact of a phenomena, meaning a mental phenomena, a mental sense power, and a mental consciousness. And so it could, so that's just 6 ways of differentiating that discrimination happens in every moment of consciousness, and it could be with any of those 6, depending on which one is the main, which one is happening to perceive the object. I think that's pretty easy. The next section is harder, so we'll take a little longer with it, because then there's another way of different. It's funny, discriminating 6 types of discrimination, right? So you have to say, you can say discriminating or differentiating 6 types of discrimination. Anyway, that's fun. In terms of the object of observation. And so it lists, right, these 6 are listed. The discrimination with signs, the discrimination without signs, the discrimination of the small, the discrimination of the vast, the discrimination of the limitless, and the discrimination thinking there is nothing. One point that's worth noting here, I think it is, and we'll get into it in this section, but we're going to get into very subtle levels in this one, but I think it's worth noting that this mental factor of discrimination can be actually just an ordinary. I'm going to say something about just ordinary experience now, because this is going to get into kind of experience in meditation and so on. But I just want to pause and note something, which is like, one is it can be very clear and what's the word, vivid, or it can be vague and confused, right? So discrimination is always functioning, but that doesn't mean it's always clear, is one point. And actually, just in your ordinary experience, I just want to suggest this is a mindfulness exercise, right? You could actually be aware, like start to notice your own mental factor of discrimination, right? And when is it sensory? Actually, it's hard if you start to do it. When are you discriminating based on a sensory consciousness, and when is it mental? If we're not used to differentiating those, we don't notice the difference, actually, do we? Like oftentimes, when are we using terms? Because we don't always. It's easy when you first meet somebody, right? And then you're learning their name, then it's kind of obvious. But in real daily life, it's often subtle, right? Because you're going back and forth between sensory and mental, and then sensory and then mental. So one point I want to make is that's just interesting. Another point I want to make is that sometimes it's quite vivid and clear, and sometimes it's confused, right? Like actually, when you're first waking up, there's the mental factor of discrimination, but how clear is it? Then compare that to if somebody's like, if you're, actually, I just think it's quite interesting to think about that, right? When you're first waking up and you're groggy versus like, think of like a moment when you're out on like a hike somewhere and it's like a very clear, crisp day and you're feeling very alert, both have a factor of discrimination. But anyway, at least for me, sometimes like when I'm first waking up, I can be like, what? Like kind of, it's very vague kind of differentiation. Then there are other times where it's extremely, experientially quite clear. So anyway, that's one thing. But then here we're going to get into so discrimination with signs. First of all, discrimination with signs, sign means language here. So again, it's confusing because earlier sign meant non-linguistic, right? That's why I said it was a little, but here sign means using language. And Art Engel in his book, on the 5 skandhas, says sign means using language, and so it says a quality of an object's essential nature is differentiated or discriminated based on words. It's an ascribed nature based on names and terms. And then there are 3 types of this one, 3 subsets here, right? A, discrimination skilled in the relationship between names and objects. Discrimination observing the compounded the impermanent, and so on, and discrimination having a clear object of observation and subjective aspect. So the first one is very clear. Discrimination skilled in the relationship between names and objects, means that you know the right terms, right? And again, I want to point out like that this is contextual, isn't it? Like so I mean, if like like I gave the example earlier of an infant wouldn't be good, wouldn't be skilled in the relationship between names and objects in general, right? But then so it's getting at, do you know the name of a thing and therefore its unique feature or uncommon feature. And and in general, I guess, like, if you say in general, we might know that, like, like, do you know what a chair is? Like, we all know what a chair is, right? So that's easy. That we would be skilled in the relationship between names and terms. So I mean, when you see a chair, you can go, oh, that's a chair, right? Sometimes young children can't tell, they're confused. Is that a chair? Is that a table? Or is that a bench? Or is it a whatever? But then, like, I don't know, I'm just pausing to reflect on this one myself, but like, if I looked at Mike and I thought of airplane parts, like, if somebody put me in an airplane sort of place where they were like a garage, or and said, I would be unskilled in the relationship, like I wouldn't know. Somebody said, what's the function of this? What's its uncommon feature? I would have no idea, right? Whereas Mike would have a very clear, he would be skilled in that, so he would know the term for that, right? Or I work in psychology, so like, if somebody said, oh, does this person have this diagnosis or something? Well, I'm educated in that, so I would be relatively skilled in the relationship with that name, and so on. Everybody has, so there are areas where we're all skilled in it, and then there are areas where you have some special training, but point being, like, that's contextual, but it's that you know the name for something, right? And therefore you can discriminate based on a sign, which means based on language. The next one would be discrimination observing the compounded, the impermanent, and so on, right? That would be, now you're getting into, are you, in other words, can you differentiate those features of your experience, which are dharma, right? Not, in other words, understanding impermanence, right? Whereas, and many people, right, there's, in general, commonly we don't recognize impermanence, so it's an existent phenomena, but we don't discriminate it. But what this is getting at is, it's very important, right, from a dharma perspective, from a practitioner's perspective, it's important if you can differentiate and discriminate the impermanence, or the things are compounded, or the things are in the nature of suffering, and so on, right? The etc. would be like discriminating the feature, discriminating the features of objects or experiences in those ways, in terms of their being compounded, impermanent, in the nature of suffering, and so on, which are important from a spiritual perspective. And then discrimination having a clear object of observation and subjective aspect. I think that's clear, right? There is that there's a clear sense of subject and object. And we'll get at why that one's important in the next one, because the next three are the opposite of those, so it'll help explain those three. So discrimination without signs is also threefold. Its three kinds are the opposites of the three types of discrimination with the signs mentioned above. So then now it's going to clarify what those three were more. So the first one is discrimination unskilled in the relationship between names and objects. So that would be the opposite of the first, right? So that would be, so, and the typical example would be a toddler, right? Is not yet skilled in the relationship between names and objects, but they're or a young child, but there are many contexts in which, actually, if you put me among only Tibetan speakers, I'm unskilled in the relationship between names and objects, right? So if you put me in a store, for example, in Tibet, I would say, I would just be pointing and going, this, and I wouldn't be able to use the right term, right? So I wouldn't, so then I would be unskilled, and so on. So it depends on the context, but that would be like where you don't know the term, right? For that thing, right? Or like, I've had that where, if I'm thinking of eating dinner with Tibetan friends and not knowing the right term for what I was eating. So, trying to say this is good, but I don't even know the term for what this is. So it's contextual, but that would be unskilled, right? You don't know the term for anything. Then a discrimination not observing the compounded, the impermanent, and so on. In this context, what that refers to is a meditative absorption on ultimate truth. Actually, the first one I didn't. That was not correct. Actually, I'm sorry, I made a mistake above. So 1B should have been where you are. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. So it should be where you are observing compounded phenomena, impermanent phenomena, and so on. That should be actually discrimination. So if you're looking at compounded phenomena, impermanent phenomena, and those things, and suffering phenomena, that was correct. But it's not Dharma recognition. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It could also just be ordinary everyday perceptions of those kinds of phenomena, impermanent things. So you can be recognizing them with a Dharma awareness or without Dharma awareness, but it's recognizing things that are compounded, things that are impermanent, things that are in the nature of suffering. Anytime you're observing those, that's a discrimination with signs of the compounded, impermanent, and so on. Now, 2B actually is a meditative absorption on ultimate truth, to which no compounded phenomena appear. Or in Art's book, he says, this one refers to nirvana, in which all signs of causally conditioned entities have disappeared. So this is a meditative absorption where you're meditating in a complete direct experience of emptiness with no subject and no object, and therefore no compounded or impermanent or phenomena are appearing to you. Only emptiness is appearing to your consciousness. So that's meditative absorption on ultimate truth, a direct perception of emptiness, or nirvana itself. Those would be examples of a discrimination not observing the compounded and the impermanent because it's a direct perception of emptiness. So nothing compounded is appearing to that consciousness. That's a clear explanation. That's that one. So the other would be anything other than that. John, you have a comment or a question?
I rarely have comments, I mainly have questions. The one being with signs, one being without signs, could one also read into that one of these is conceptual and one is non-conceptual? Because there's no mention of conceptuality in any of this.
Certainly 2B would be non-conceptual. I guess I would say not necessarily. I mean, I didn't read this in the commentary, but I'll make a debate for a second. I would suggest not necessarily, and I'll say why. I'll give an example. Under 2A, the person is not yet skilled, so doesn't know the term for something. But if they're looking for the term, because remember, like meaning general, the definition of conceptual relates to a meaning generality and a sound generality, viewing them as suitably mixed, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, I'll give an example that would be I think this would be a conceptual knower. This is my own position here. Under 2A would be, my example was a young child, right? So if a young child, or actually my own example of myself, right? Like if I'll use the young child. If a young child is pointing at something and going, like, asking their parent, what's that? What is that? They don't yet know the term, but they already have, in that case, a meaning generality. They're recognizing there's something there that should have a term, right? And once you have a meaning generality, you're looking for the sound generality or the term for it, that's already conceptual. So I would argue that 2, this is my own debate here, would be that 2 would include non-conceptual knowers, but it could also include certain conceptual knowers. And my example is under A, right? A discrimination unskilled in the relation between names and objects. Or if I were with Mike and in a place where he was working on an airplane, I wouldn't know the term, so I'd be unskilled. But if I was like, oh wow, that must have a name. That piece of the engine must have some kind of name. I don't know the name for it. I'm conceptualizing, but I'm not yet skilled. I don't know the name. So that would be like, so if I'm wondering what the name is, that would be conceptual, but it's not yet. But it would still be without a sign in the sense that I don't know the name. So I don't know this. I don't know that sign yet. But it's conceptual because I have a meaning generality already. I don't have a sound.
You actually want to have the knowledge, which makes it conceptual.
Yeah, which would make, yeah. And again, because I'll go back, the meaning, when they talk about the definition of conceptual, meaning viewing a sound generality, a meaning generality is suitably mixed, they make a point. They say, if you know both, that's certainly conceptual. But if you just know the term or you just know the meaning, but you don't yet know the other, that's still conceptual because you're viewing them as suitably mixed. You're looking for the term. So if you know a term, but you don't yet, like, so they give an example, like if somebody taught you, I don't know, a Chinese word, and then you knew it meant something, but you didn't yet know what it meant, and you were kind of going, oh, what does that mean? That would still be conceptual, and vice versa. If you, like, somebody served you giving an example here, a Chinese dish, and then you said, wow, that's really good, what is that called? That would still be conceptual, that you have now a meaning generality of a sense of that's something, it must have a name, and then you're asking somebody what's the name of it. Those would still be conceptual knowers, even though you know both yet.
In the food example, you already know everything except the name.
Yeah.
From a conceptual standpoint, you know what it looks like, you know what it tastes like, you know what it smells like, you just don't know what to call it.
Yeah, and so that would be, that's a meaning generality. You know the definition in a sense, but you don't yet know the term. Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
then Lynn, yep. Lynn has, yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
I think this is an example. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I
you're good.
think this is an example of maybe what John's getting at. I was in a Starbucks. I was the only person wearing a mask. And there's a nanny with a small child in a stroller, okay? But she was very conscious of everything going on. So she points to me and she says, she doesn't have the word for mask, but she knows I'm wearing a mask and nobody else is. So she points to me in this quizzical look. And so I answer her, I say, oh, it's a mask, it's for safety. I don't like it either. But clearly she wanted to know what this was, because nobody else was wearing a mask.
Oh.
So it's sort of what John's getting at. It's a little baby or a young person. She's maybe 18 months or something. And she wanted to know what this was and why I was wearing it.
Yeah, that's a great example of, like, unskilled, right? Unskilled yet in the relationship of names and objects. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So you get the sense. So the first, and so I hope that would clarify that I said it wrong. So the under 1B, 1A and 2A are clear. 2B, again, I made that error. It could be a Dharma awareness, or it could just be an ordinary person's awareness, right? Of looking at compounded phenomena or impermanent. So it could be with awareness that, oh, that's compounded and that's impermanent, or it could be not being aware of that, but still perceiving something that's compounded and impermanent. Whereas 2B is a meditative absorption, right? Directly perceiving emptiness. So that no compounded phenomena, and remember, because in Arya's meditative equipoise, nothing is appearing, right? Except emptiness. Emptiness is appearing, but no other phenomena is appearing. No compounded phenomena appear in that meditative equipoise. So that would be, and that one would be non-conceptual. And then the last, discrimination lacking a clear object of observation and subjective aspect. This one, there were different commentaries on it, but there were different explanations that I read, but I'm going to stick with the one that seems most authoritative and correct, which is that that this one refers to, I've said this before, there are four form, it meditated in after somebody's achieved combining, there are 4 form realm absorptions and then 4 formless realm absorptions, each of which is more subtle, right? The 4 form realm absorptions go from, I would say, grosser to more subtle, although they're all, even the grossest is extremely much more subtle than our kind of awareness in the desire realm, but they become more and more rarefied or more and more subtle. And then the formless realms, again, are more and more subtle. And the most subtle of all the formless realms is has different names to it. Sometimes it's called the peak of samsara, or sometimes it's called without discrimination, not without discrimination is another name for that. So this last one is referring to that most rarefied of all the, so it's the peak of samsara, it's the most subtle of all meditative absorptions. And what this is getting at is that where it says discrimination lacking a clear object of observation and subjective aspect, is that meditative absorption at the peak of samsara, it says, because one of the names of that one is without discrimination, but not without discrimination. And what that means is there is no gross discrimination at that level, but there's an extremely subtle level of discrimination still functioning. So in other words, that it's a, yeah, so it's like a, anyway, because what are those? They're, consciousness, yeah. It's like it's the most subtle, that's not, it's like you're trying not to discriminate anything, but there's still a subtle level of discrimination. And actually going back to Frank's point, from a Majamaka perspective, actually what's still being discriminated is true existence, or inherent existence from Majamaka's perspective. There's still a kind of grasping at, there's no gross grasping at self and other, but there's a very subtle self-grasping that's still there. So there's kind of very subtle level of discrimination. So that being is still in samsara, but there's no gross discrimination. So that's why it says discrimination lacking a clear object of observation and subjective aspect. So it's this extremely subtle level of discrimination that keeps that being stuck in samsara. Is part of the point. But there's not. There's no gross discrimination for that being at that level. Then the next one, 3, a discrimination of the small, or some one translator translated as the limited, and that refers to discriminations in the continuum of an ordinary being of the desire realm who has not obtained an actual concentration, and discrimination observing the attributes of the desire realm. So you could say, small or limited because our desire realm is, I like limited actually. And I'm going to say discrimination of the vast, I prefer great as the translation. I just think that gets at the feeling of it more. Like, if you say, well, we're kind of limited in our scope. In other words, we don't appreciate how wonderful other realms of experience can be. So we're limited beings in the sense of in the desire realm, we're stuck. So so on the one hand, and obviously we're in the desire realm, right? Human beings are beings of the desire realm. Animals are as well, and so on. So it says here, discriminations in the continuum of an ordinary being of the desire realm. That's like us, right? But that's also anybody you come across, any ordinary person you come across. Who has not obtained an actual concentration. So that means they haven't yet achieved calm abiding and entered the form realm, or the formless realms, right? And then discrimination observing attributes of the desire realm is, what are attributes of the desire realm? They're actually, it's if you haven't yet achieved the first concentration of the form realm, everything you've ever experienced in this life would be an attribute of the desire realm, right? Your own body, your own mind, your house, your car, your neighborhood, your friends, your enemies, your strangers, your mountains and rivers and trees, and those are all attributes of the desire realm. So all the things we ordinarily experience are attributes of the desire realm. And then to contrast that, discrimination of the vast, right, or the great. I prefer great on this one because it implies what this is getting at, which is it's greater than the former. It's it's great because it's superior to the desire realm. It's vast, it's bigger. I think great gets at the feeling more. It's better. It's greater than the desire realm. So discrimination of the great or the vast refers to discrimination observing the form realm and discriminations in the continua of form realm beings. And so form realm are those 4 concentrations. And again, those are only accessed by somebody you could who's achieved that level of concentration, right? But they're lower than the formless realms, but higher than the desire realm from a perspective of subtlety and pleasure or joy or well-being. And what makes them better is that, first of all, there are fewer afflictive emotions in those realms. Beings for example, beings in the form realm can't give rise to anger. Anger is an attribute, a feature of the desire realm. So as long as you're in the form realm, you don't become angry, and so on. And one reason why it says discrimination observing the form realm and discrimination of continua of form realm beings is that there are beings who are reborn in the form realm gods, they call them, who abide in that form realm. And so any discrimination of those beings while they're in the form realm would be discrimination of the great or the vast. But what does this mean? Discrimination observing the form realm. That can refer to those beings, but that can also refer to you, actually. In other words, if you develop Shine, or how do you say it? Shamatha, right? Shine is Tibetan, Shamatha is Sanskrit. But if you develop Shamatha and you enter the form realm concentrations, you're still human, right? But at that time, you're experiencing the form realm, so you're experiencing a discrimination of the vast. One more small point to make here is that part of this process of discrimination around the form realm versus desire realm is how you enter the form realm. So in other words, I'll just quickly describe this. So somebody who has achieved calm abiding, shamatha, right? Actually, one of the features of discrimination is that they then, I mentioned this last class, and that being discriminates. In other words, they recognize, oh, look, they recognize this is the desire realm. They're still human, right? They're a human being who has achieved shamatha and is on the cusp of form realm absorption. They discriminate the desire realm and look and say, wow, that's the desire realm. And then they can observe that it's in the nature of gross suffering, right, and mental afflictions. Then they discriminate, recognizing that's the form realm. That's the experience of the form realm. That's what that would be like. And then they recognize that's better than this, right? That the form realm is a better realm. It's a vaster realm. It's a greater realm. And therefore, that's how they transfer into that realm. And then the same thing happens when they're going from the first level of form realm to the second, is they reach a level of concentration where they can see what the next level would be like and what their current level is like, and they see that one's better. And then they recognize that one has more subtlety, is more pleasant, is less afflicted. And then they transfer into that. And discrimination, my point is just that this feature of discrimination of the vast, for somebody with that level of concentration, it plays a role in how they transfer from one level to the next. And the same thing keeps going, as we'll get to here. Because the next one is discrimination of the limitless, or the infinite. And this refers to discriminations observing the source of infinite space and the source of infinite consciousness. So those are the first two levels of the formless realm. And so that's a different level, right? That's no longer just great, it's infinite. And actually, those are the names of those. So like, in other words, when somebody gets to the highest of the four levels of the form realm, if they want to sort of have a more rarefied, more subtle, more pleasurable experience, then they stop focusing on form and they focus on infinite, limitless space. Right? And if their mind becomes completely absorbed in a discrimination or a recognition or a concentration on infinite space, then they're in the first level of the formless realm. And it's formless because there's no form, there's no body there. It's just infinite space, right? It's a mental consciousness totally absorbed in infinite space. And more subtle than that is the next. That's the second of the formless realm absorptions, which is infinite consciousness. And you can see, I'll just mention here in the footnote, it says the four levels of the formless realm are infinite space, infinite consciousness, and nothingness. Oh, and then the last one is the one we'll talk about. I'll mention again in a second, but those are the four levels. So this discrimination of the infinite refers to the first two, discrimination on the level of the first two levels of the formless realm. And there's still discrimination there, right? It's discriminating. This is infinite. It discriminates. This is infinite space, or this is infinite consciousness. And that's discrimination at those levels. John, do you have a question?
You may have covered this and I just missed it because I missed the last couple of classes. But the form versus formless realms, when I think of Buddhism and I think of the realms, I think of the six, I guess, levels of rebirth. Are the form realms the first with the hell beast, walking ghosts, animals, and humans, or?
No, so all the the desire realm includes hell beings, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, demigods, and some gods. And then
Okay.
so there are desire realm gods who are like in pleasurable party realms, or whatever. They're in realms of physical desire, pleasure.
Right.
Then but then the form realm is a different type of god. So we would call them, the form realm and the formless realm would be included under certain god realm beings. So if you want to categorize the form and the formless realms in the context of the 6 realms, then certain form realm and certain form realm, there is certain gods are in the form realm and certain gods are in the formless realm. So those would be categorized under god realms.
So by the time you get to form realms and formless realms, you've already gone into bodhisattvas and Buddhas then?
Not necessarily, because there are samsaric beings in the god realms.
Okay.
And you could take rebirth. So Buddhism, bodhisattvas do go to these realms, and so do, but an ordinary like a non-Arya, so a person who's not seen emptiness, who
Right.
develops calm abiding, can enter those realms and take rebirth in those realms, but still be well within samsara, and then they fall from those realms back to being an animal, for example, or whatever.
But they, at some point during that enlightened state or the semi-enlightened or approaching it, they had moved from the desire realms into the form realms or the formless realms.
Yeah, but again, you can fall back. So in other words,
Right.
those aren't permanent. They're like blissful realms that one can either enter as a human being who's achieved concentration, or by doing that, you could take rebirth there, but they're not permanent escapes from samsara, is the idea.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I know it's 12:30. I'll just mention the last one because and then we'll finish this page. So that's good. So the last is discrimination of nothingness, refers to discrimination observing the source of nothingness. And so that is a reference to the third of the formless realms, right? And again, you get the sense that these realms are where the meditator is focusing on infinite space. And infinite space is grosser. Infinite consciousness is more subtle, right? Then the next person, they're focusing on nothing, right? Nothingness. And actually, it's important. That's why emptiness is not nothingness, right? If you focus on emptiness of intrinsic existence, you can be liberated from samsara. If you focus on nothingness, you can take rebirth in the formless realm of nothingness, which is not liberation. It's a rarefied sort of state of concentration. That's like taking a break. It's like taking a vacation from gross desire realm suffering, but it's not a liberation. And the fourth level of the formless realm doesn't have its own separate section here because it was covered under 2C, right? Discrimination lacking a clear object of observation and subjective aspect. That was the peak of existence, or the peak of samsara, rather, which is so that would be the fourth level of the formless realm. So those are it's making a point that discrimination functions on all these different levels, right? All the way from the lowest hell being up to the peak of samsara. The mental factor of discrimination is there and is functioning, sometimes on a gross level and sometimes on a subtler level, but it's always present. It's omnipresent. Okay, so we should stop there. And next class we'll get to intention, which is very much, a very important one because it's about karma. Right, because karma is intention, or that's one way of saying it. Mental karma is intention, and intention is the source of all karmic action, you could say. But anyways, we covered discrimination, and if you have more questions about discrimination, you can ask them next class if you want to, and that's already scheduled. The classes for August are already scheduled. It's in a few weeks though. And again, I just want to apologize for today, the problem with the center's Zoom. And if and some people will be watching this on YouTube, so apologies to you all too. We recorded this one, so we're recording this one, so it'll be posted there. But sorry that the center Zoom didn't work, but we'll have that back to correct for next time. So we'll go back to the normal link next time. But thanks everybody. We'll do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. They dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. So the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Sujata, for quickly coming up with this solution.
No problem. I'll send it to you right away so you can figure out how to do all the things.
Okay, yeah, I'll send it on to Dojo. He posts everything to YouTube, so that's great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
you.
Thanks, Lauren.
Appreciate it.